They say you can get used to anything, even the graveyard shift. But the Omni-Mart on the edge of Crestwood Hills isn't just about the quiet hum of freezers or the lonely echo of your own footsteps down fluorescent-lit canyons of breakfast cereal and discount detergent. There's a stillness here after midnight that breathes. It watches. I know, because I felt its gaze on the back of my neck, cold and calculating, more times than I can count. It's a peculiar kind of haunting, one that doesn't involve rattling chains or spectral figures, but rather the subtle warping of the mundane, the quiet insistence that the world as you know it is a thin veneer over something else, something that has its own rules. My name is Michael Carter, Mike to most, though few call me anything these days. I took this job, stocking shelves from midnight till the first hint of dawn bleeds into the sky, for Jessica, my little sister. The medical bills for her condition pile up like unread newspapers, each one a stark reminder of why I subject myself to this nightly ritual. The fluorescent lights buzz a monotonous hymn above, casting a sickly yellow pallor on everything, making even the most vibrant packaging look tired and drained. It's a world away from the sunlit rooms Jessica inhabits, a world I try to keep separate, but the edges are blurring. The exhaustion gnaws at me, a constant companion, but it's the other thing, the awareness of the store, that truly settles deep in my bones. Crestwood Hills is like any other sprawling suburb, a place of trimmed lawns and quiet streets, where nothing truly interesting is supposed to happen. The Omni-Mart, a behemoth of consumerism, sits on its periphery like a patient predator. During the day, it's a cacophony of squeaking carts, beeping scanners, and chattering families. But at night, it transforms. The vastness becomes oppressive, the silence punctuated by the rhythmic click of my price gun or the distant groan of the building settling. It's in these moments, when I'm alone in aisle 7 with the canned soups, that the store feels most alive, most attentive. The air grows heavy, the shadows deepen, and I can almost hear it thinking. The work itself is mindless, a welcome distraction most nights. Unpack boxes, check expiration dates, arrange products in neat, orderly rows. There's a certain zen to it, a small island of control in the chaos of my life. But even that is being eroded. Sometimes I'll turn my back for a moment only to find a can of beans has shifted, or a box of crackers is slightly askew, as if nudged by an unseen hand. At first, I dismissed it as my tired mind playing tricks. Now, I'm not so sure. The store seems to have preferences, opinions even, a quiet disapproval when things aren't just so. The weight of Jessica's illness is a physical ache in my chest. Every extra shift, every hour spent under these buzzing lights is for her. For the medication that keeps the pain at bay, for the specialists who speak in hushed, expensive tones. She doesn't know the half of what this job entails, the creeping unease that has become my shadow. I paint a picture of boring, uneventful nights, of simply putting things on shelves. How could I tell her about the feeling of being watched by the security cameras, not just recorded, but seen, understood, in a way that makes my skin crawl? How could I explain the way the air sometimes thickens, a palpable pressure, just before something odd happens? The other night shifters are a sparse crew, mostly ghosts themselves, flitting through the aisles with a practiced weariness. There's Frank Dalton, a man who looks like he's been old for a very long time, his eyes holding a deep, unsettling knowledge. He nods sometimes, but rarely speaks. And Miss Harper, the night manager, a woman whose smile never quite reaches her eyes, her efficiency almost unnervingly precise. They move through this nocturnal landscape like initiated members of a silent order, an order I'm beginning to suspect I've unwillingly joined. They don't talk about the oddities, the subtle shifts in reality. It's an unspoken agreement, perhaps. Or maybe they just don't see it anymore. Or worse, they do. I often find myself staring up at the rows of security cameras, those unblinking black eyes. They pan and tilt with a silent, mechanical grace. But lately, I've had the distinct impression that their movements are not random. They follow me. Not just my general location, but my specific actions, lingering when I pause, focusing when I seem troubled. It's an intelligence, I'm sure of it. A vast, distributed consciousness woven into the very fabric of the Omnimart, a silent, ever-present overseer. And I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. The ache for normalcy is a dull throb behind my temples. I remember a time when my biggest worry was a college exam or a flat tire. Now it's the oppressive silence of aisle 3 after 3 a.m., the way the shadows seem to writhe just at the edge of my vision, the subtle, almost inaudible hum that seems to emanate from the floor itself. It's the growing certainty that this store, this sprawling temple of commerce, is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a construct, a system, and I am a small, insignificant cog within its intricate and perhaps malevolent machinery. Before all this truly began, before the list and the rules it contained surfaced from the forgotten depths of this place, I used to think the worst part of this job was the loneliness, or the bone-deep fatigue that settled in around 4 a.m. I was naive. The real horror isn't in the emptiness, but in the subtle, creeping suggestion that you are not, in fact, alone at all. That something is always there, just beyond the periphery, observing, cataloging, and waiting. What happens when the mundane cracks and you catch a glimpse of the machinery beneath? What happens when you realize the rules aren't for the store, but for you? It was during my second week, a Tuesday or perhaps a Wednesday. The nights blur into a single, unending twilight. I was in the back, in the cramped, windowless break room that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, looking for an extra box cutter. The room doubled as a storage space for forgotten relics of Omnimart past, old promotional posters, broken mannequins missing limbs, and a bank of rusted metal lockers that probably hadn't been opened since the store's grand opening decades ago. One of them, locker number 7, hung slightly ajar, its lock long since busted. Curiosity, or maybe just the desire to procrastinate for a few more minutes, got the better of me. Inside, amidst dust bunnies the size of small rodents and a single petrified athletic sock, was a sheet of paper. Not just any paper. It was thick, almost like cardstock, yellowed with age and laminated. The plastic bubbled and peeling at the edges. Typed on it, in a stark utilitarian font, was the heading, Essential Nightly Directives, Omnimart, Crestwood Hills. Below it, a numbered list. I remember a small, involuntary laugh escaping me. Essential Nightly Directives? It sounded like something out of a low-budget horror film, or a prank left by some long-gone, disgruntled employee with a twisted sense of humor. The rules themselves only solidified this impression. 1. Never acknowledge the mannequins in the apparel section, aisle 12, after 2 a.m. Acknowledge them? What did that even mean? Was I supposed to ignore their silent, plastic judgment as I restocked a nearby end cap of discounted socks? The absurdity of it was almost comical. 2. If a product returns to the shelf by its own accord, do not reposition. Let it be. Right, because cans of soup routinely develop sentience and a desire for their original shelf space. The list went on, each directive more bizarre than the last, a litany of nonsensical prohibitions that seemed to have no bearing on the efficient operation of a 24-hour retail establishment. 3. Expired items from the Fresh Delights deli counter must be logged only in the physical occurrence ledger, manager's office, never in the digital system. This one almost seemed plausible, some arcane bureaucratic quirk, until you consider the sheer inefficiency. 4. Do not respond to any summons over the PA system after the final closing announcement, even if your name is used. My name? The PA system was usually dead silent after Miss Harper made her final monotone walkie-talkie check-in. The thought of it crackling to life, calling for me, sent a small, unwelcome shiver down my spine. Despite my skepticism, this was just a prank, I told myself, a well-preserved, elaborate prank. The list continued, each rule a small, strange stone dropped into the placid pool of my nightly routine. 5. Storage Bay B, frozen goods sector, must remain locked and inaccessible between 3:33 a.m. and 4:04 a.m. Do not enter, do not look within. A very specific time frame. What could possibly be happening in a freezer bay for precisely 31 minutes in the dead of night? 6. If a shopping list written in red ink is found abandoned in a cart, do not follow its contents. Dispose of it immediately in the secure document shredder in the manager's office. Red ink. The detail was oddly specific, unsettlingly so. It painted a picture, not of a forgetful shopper, but of something more deliberate, more pointed. The final rule was perhaps the most peculiar, and the one that for some reason stuck with me the longest, a tiny burr of unease. 7. Never gaze at your own reflection in the security monitors for more than 5 continuous seconds. Why? What could possibly happen? Would my reflection wave back? Would it distort into something monstrous? The sheer, unadulterated strangeness of it all was almost overwhelming. I folded the laminated sheet, the crinkling plastic loud in the sudden silence of the break room, and shoved it into the back pocket of my jeans. A relic, a curiosity, nothing more. That's what I told myself. I didn't mention it to Frank Dalton, whose weathered face seemed to hold the silent history of 1,000 such nights. Nor did I bring it up with Miss Harper, whose brisk efficiency left little room for such frivolities. It was just a piece of forgotten lore, a testament to the boredom that can fester in the quiet hours of the graveyard shift. I went back to my palette of isotonic sports drinks, the rhythmic beep of my price gun a comforting return to the tangible, the understandable. The list, however, stayed in my pocket, a faint weight, a silent, nagging question mark. But the store, it seemed, had other ideas. Or perhaps by finding the list, I had inadvertently acknowledged something, tripped some invisible wire in the store's complex, unseen circuitry. The air in aisle 4, the soft drinks aisle, suddenly felt colder, the hum of the refrigerated units a little louder, a little more insistent. I remember pausing, a bottle of luridly blue liquid in my hand, and looking up at the nearest security camera. Its black, unblinking lens was pointed directly at me. For a moment, just a fleeting, irrational moment, I had the distinct impression that it knew. It knew I had the list. And as I stood there, bathed in the fluorescent glow, a single bottle of a rival brand, Cherry Red, slowly, almost deliberately, toppled from the shelf 3 feet to my left. It didn't just fall, it tipped, as if nudged by an invisible finger, landing with a soft, almost apologetic thud on the linoleum floor. I stared at it, then back at the camera. The list in my pocket suddenly felt heavier, the plastic colder against my skin. A prank, I had thought. But the silence that followed, a deep, expectant hush, felt anything but playful. It felt like the beginning of something. The cherry red bottle lay on the pristine linoleum, a small, defiant splash of color in the otherwise monotonous landscape of aisle 4. My first instinct, ingrained by months of repetitive restocking, was to pick it up and place it back where it belonged. But then a fragment of the list surfaced in my mind, unbidden. If a product returns to the shelf by its own accord, do not reposition. Let it be. Of course, this bottle hadn't returned to the shelf, it had fallen from it. Still, the word I hesitated, my hand hovering over the bottle. This was ridiculous. It was a fallen soda. Yet the air around me remained charged, thick with that same expectant silence I'd felt moments before. The security camera, a dark, unblinking eye, seemed to bore into me. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple, cold in the refrigerated air. Letting a single bottle lie on the floor all night? Miss Harper would have my hide if she saw it during her rounds. But the warning on that aged, laminated sheet, as absurd as it was, resonated with a primal caution, a whisper from the store's forgotten past. I decided, with a surge of what felt like foolish defiance, to leave it. Just this once. The rest of that shift passed in a haze of heightened awareness. Every creak of the building, every distant hum of machinery seemed amplified, imbued with a new significance. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see, I didn't know what. The bottle remained untouched in aisle 4, a silent testament to my minor act of rebellion, or perhaps my first act of unwitting compliance. When I clocked out, just as the first gray light of dawn was staining the eastern sky, I cast a final look towards the aisle. The bottle was still there, but the air around it felt calmer, as if a small internal pressure within the store had been momentarily released. It was 2 nights later, while restocking the endless, soulless expanse of aisle 12, apparel, that the second rule was tested. The hour was well past 2 in the morning, that dead zone when the world outside feels impossibly distant and the fluorescent lights of the Omnimart become your entire universe. I was wrestling with a tangled heap of discounted t-shirts when I noticed it. One of the mannequins, a female form draped in a garishly patterned sundress, had its plastic hand outstretched, fingers slightly curled, as if reaching for something, or someone. Its painted eyes, usually vacant and staring straight ahead, seemed focused on me. Never acknowledge the mannequins in the apparel section, aisle 12, after 2 a.m. My heart gave a stupid, frightened lurch. Acknowledge? What did that mean? Don't look at them? Don't talk to them? Surely they didn't expect me to start having conversations with plastic dummies. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the t-shirts, but the mannequin's silent, outstretched hand was a persistent distraction in my peripheral vision. It was just a piece of molded plastic, I told myself. Its pose was probably just a result of some previous customer or another stalker bumping into it. Yet the intensity of its perceived gaze, the subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of its head, felt deeply, unnervingly personal. Without thinking, driven by a sudden, perverse impulse to break the spell, to prove the absurdity of it all, I looked directly at it, and then I spoke. Just a single muttered word. "Problem?" I asked the mannequin, my voice a dry croak in the cavernous silence. The moment the word left my lips, the bank of fluorescent lights directly above aisle 12 flickered violently, once, twice, then plunged the entire section into a disorienting, momentary darkness. My breath hitched. When the lights stuttered back on, a fraction of a second later, the mannequin was no longer reaching. Its hand was by its side, its head facing forward, its eyes as vacant and lifeless as ever. But on the floor, directly in front of it, lay a single, perfectly folded t-shirt, one I hadn't touched. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of my exhaustion. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. The list, that ridiculous laminated sheet of rules, was real. And I had just broken another one. I backed away from aisle 12 slowly, my eyes darting around, convinced now that every shadow held a watching presence. The t-shirt lay on the floor, a small, silent accusation. I didn't touch it. I didn't dare. The store was testing me, or perhaps I was testing it, and I had a sinking feeling that I was losing, that I was being drawn into a game whose rules I was only just beginning to comprehend. The following nights were a tightrope walk of paranoia and feigned ignorance. I avoided aisle 12 after 2 a.m. like the plague. I left fallen items where they lay, no matter how out of place they seemed. I started to notice other things too. The way Frank Dalton, the ancient night shifter, would sometimes pause and cock his head, as if listening to a conversation I couldn't hear. The way Miss Harper's eyes would occasionally flick towards a security monitor with an expression that was less managerial oversight and more proprietary assessment. They knew. They had to know. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the cameras anymore. It was the air itself, the oppressive weight of the silence, the subtle shifts in temperature from one aisle to the next. It was the distinct impression that my thoughts, my anxieties, my growing fear were somehow being registered, cataloged. The Omnimart was more than a building. It was a consciousness, vast and indifferent, and I was a tiny, irritating speck under its immense, unblinking scrutiny. And the rules, I was beginning to understand, weren't just arbitrary guidelines, they were boundaries, and I was straying dangerously close to crossing them. The pressure was building, a slow, inexorable tightening in my chest. Each shift felt like a descent deeper into a rabbit hole I hadn't even realized I was approaching. The list of rules, once a source of morbid amusement, had become my unwilling guide, a cursed map through a landscape that was growing increasingly hostile and alien. I found myself rereading it during my short, solitary breaks, the laminated plastic growing warm and pliable in my trembling hands, each directive now imbued with a chilling resonance. The world of the Omnimart was asserting itself, its subtle anomalies escalating into undeniable intrusions. One particularly grim Thursday night, or perhaps Friday morning, the distinction had become meaningless. I was in the dairy section, the hum of the coolers a monotonous dirge. I was documenting a pallet of near-expired yogurt, the sickly sweet smell clinging to the air. Rule 3. Expired items from the Fresh Delights deli counter must be logged only in the physical occurrence ledger, manager's office, never in the digital system. This wasn't deli, but the principle felt transferable, an underlying logic to the store's madness. My handheld scanner, the one we used for inventory and spoilage, suddenly beeped erratically, its screen flashing a garbled series of symbols before going completely blank. I swore under my breath, tapping it uselessly. Just then, Frank Dalton materialized from the end of the aisle, silent as a wraith. His deeply lined face was unreadable in the dim light, but his eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes, were fixed on the dead scanner in my hand. "System's been temperamental lately," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across concrete. "Especially with the disposals." He paused, then added, so quietly I almost missed it, "Some things, this place prefers the old ways. Pen and paper. Less traceable." He didn't look at me, his gaze drifting towards the humming coolers, as if they held a secret he was privy to. "Traceable by who, Frank?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The question hung in the chilled air. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment. There was a flicker of something there. Pity, perhaps? Or a shared, weary understanding. "By whatever keeps the books, son," he said, before shuffling off into the gloom, leaving me with more questions than answers. Whatever keeps the books. The phrase echoed in my mind, conjuring images not of accountants and spreadsheets, but of something far older, far more fundamental. Later that same shift, driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate need for confirmation, I deliberately sought out a discarded shopping list. It wasn't hard to find. People left them everywhere. But this one, tucked into the child seat of an abandoned cart near the pet food aisle, was different. It was written in a spidery, almost illegible hand, and the ink, a vivid, unsettling crimson, seemed to almost pulse under the fluorescent lights. Rule 6. If a shopping list written in red ink is found abandoned in a cart, do not follow its contents. Dispose of it immediately in the secure document shredder in the manager's office. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. Another test. I should have taken it straight to Miss Harper's office, to the humming shredder that sat beside her meticulously organized desk. But a reckless curiosity, a morbid desire to peek behind the curtain, took hold. I wouldn't follow it, of course not. But what harm could there be in simply looking? The list was short. Milk, whole; bread, sourdough; apples, red; regret. The last item was written in larger, more emphatic strokes, the red ink darker, almost black. Regret? What kind of grocery item was regret? A cold dread seeped into me. This wasn't just a shopping list. It was a message, or a trap. Instead of shredding it, I crumpled it into a tight ball and tossed it into a regular trash receptacle near the checkout lanes. A compromise, I told myself, a partial defiance. The moment the crumpled paper left my hand, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The familiar hum of the store seemed to deepen, to drop in pitch, becoming a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. From the far end of the store, near the pharmacy, I heard a sound like a dozen glass jars shattering simultaneously, followed by a profound, echoing silence. No alarm, no announcement, just that sudden, violent noise. And then, nothing. I found Frank near the scene, if you could call it that. There was no broken glass, no sign of any disturbance. Just Frank, staring at an empty shelf where the expensive imported olives usually sat, a strange, almost wistful expression on his face. "Heard that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Frank nodded slowly. "The store, it redecorates sometimes," he said, his gaze distant. "Especially when it's displeased." He looked at me then, a direct, piercing stare. "You didn't happen to find anything unusual tonight, did you, Mike? Something you maybe shouldn't have kept? The implication was clear. The store knew. Frank knew. This wasn't just a series of isolated incidents or my overworked imagination. There was a presence here, an intelligence, ancient and vast, that permeated every inch of the Omnimart. It had its routines, its preferences, its rules, and it reacted, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, to any deviation. I was no longer just a stalker. I was an unwilling participant in a silent, ongoing dialogue with something that defied comprehension, something that saw the Omnimart not as a place of commerce, but its domain. And I was beginning to understand that the price of working here might be far higher than my meager paycheck. It might be my sanity, or something more. The weight of the Omnimart's unseen scrutiny began to press down on me, not just during my shifts, but in the precious, fleeting hours of daylight as well. Sleep became a shallow, troubled thing, populated by endless aisles, flickering lights, and the unsettling feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. I'd jerk awake in my small rented room, the scent of floor wax and refrigerated air still clinging to me like a shroud, my heart pounding from dreams I couldn't quite recall, only the lingering dread they left behind. The lines between the night world of the store and my daytime existence were becoming increasingly blurred, porous. Jessica was the first to truly notice. During one of my daytime visits to the sterile, quiet facility where she spent most of her hours, she'd looked at me, her gaze, usually so bright despite her frailness, clouded with concern. "You look awful, Mike," she'd said, her voice small. Are you okay? You seem so jumpy." I'd forced a smile, a weak imitation of reassurance. "Just tired, Jess. Long hours, you know." But she wasn't fooled. She knew me too well. The dark circles under my eyes were stark against my pale skin, and I found myself flinching at sudden noises, my attention constantly drifting as if listening for something only I could hear. How could I explain it to her? How could I articulate the creeping paranoia, the sense that the very building I worked in was a sentient entity with a vested interest in my adherence to a set of bizarre, unwritten, or rather written, but inexplicably potent laws? She would think I was losing my mind, that the stress of her illness and the burden of the bills had finally cracked me. And perhaps she wouldn't be wrong. The thought terrified me. Was this the Omnimart's doing? Or was it me, my own mind fracturing under the accumulated weight of it all? The ambiguity was a torment in itself. The pressure to provide for Jessica, to ensure she had every possible comfort, every necessary treatment, was a relentless engine driving me back to that place night after night. The thought of quitting, of walking away from the Omnimart and its suffocating secrets, was a constant, seductive whisper. But then the image of her pale face, the quiet courage in her eyes, would flash in my mind, and the whisper would be drowned out by the harsh reality of overdue notices and prescription costs. I was trapped, a rat in a maze designed by a bored, malevolent god, with the cheese of Jessica's well-being always just out of reach, demanding I navigate the increasingly perilous corridors. My interactions with Miss Harper, the night manager, became a subtle, unnerving dance. Her usual brisk professionalism was now tinged with an unnerving perspicacity. She'd find me in a deserted aisle, her approach always silent, and ask, "Everything all right, Carter? You seem a little distracted tonight." Her smile was a thin, bloodless line, her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, sharp and analytical. It felt less like genuine concern and more like an assessment, a quiet probing of my deteriorating composure. Did she know about the list? Was she a guardian of its secrets, or just another, more deeply entangled victim? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty was another layer of dread. Frank Dalton remained an enigma, a silent, watchful presence. Sometimes I'd catch him observing me from a distance, his expression unreadable. On rare occasions, he'd offer a cryptic fragment, a morsel of unsettling wisdom that hinted at a vast hidden knowledge. "The store has a long memory, son," he'd rasped once, after I'd narrowly avoided looking directly into a security monitor for too long. "Remembers every rule broken, every debt incurred." His words hung in the air like a prophecy, a chilling reminder that my transgressions were not going unnoticed, that a tally was being kept somewhere in the Omnimart's cold, indifferent heart. The paranoia began to bleed into my meager social interactions outside of work. A casual glance from a stranger on the bus felt like scrutiny. The flickering of a streetlight seemed like a coded message. I started to see patterns where none existed, to hear whispers in the rustling of leaves. The Omnimart was reprogramming me, its strange logic seeping into the very foundation of my perception. I was becoming isolated, not just by the nocturnal hours of my job, but by the singular, terrifying nature of what I was experiencing. Who could I possibly confide in? Who would ever believe me? The financial strain was a constant, grinding pressure, but it was the erosion of my own sanity that truly terrified me. I found myself compulsively checking the laminated list in my pocket, its rules becoming a perverse sort of catechism. Each one was a potential pitfall, a trigger for some unknown, unpleasant consequence. The simple act of stocking shelves, once a mindless routine, was now fraught with a hyper-vigilant tension. Was that can of peas really where I'd left it? Did that mannequin in aisle 12 just twitch? The store was a minefield, and I was navigating it blindfolded, guided only by a set of cryptic warnings from a forgotten past. And through it all, Jessica remained my anchor, my reason. But even that anchor was beginning to feel strained. Our conversations became stilted, my reassurances sounding increasingly hollow even to my own ears. I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that her brother, her protector, was slipping away from her. The guilt was a corrosive acid, eating away at me. I was failing her, not just financially, but emotionally. The Omnimart wasn't just taking my sleep and my peace of mind, it was taking my ability to be there for the one person who mattered most. The human cost of its strange dominion was becoming devastatingly clear. The breaking point, when it finally arrived, wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a monstrous revelation. It was quieter, more insidious, a slow unraveling that began with a phone call. Jessica had had a bad night, a complication. The doctors were monitoring the situation. That sterile, non-committal phrase that always meant things were worse than they were letting on. I finished the call in the cramped break room, the cheap plastic receiver slick with sweat in my hand, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The walls of the Omnimart suddenly felt like they were closing in, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights an unbearable, grating assault on my frayed nerves. I stumbled out of the break room, needing to move, to do something, anything to distract from the fear coiling in my gut. The store was a tomb, silent and vast. And then it happened. The PA system, usually dead after Miss Harper's final check-in, crackled to life. Not with static, not with a burst of feedback, but with a single, clear, almost gentle chime, like a distant wind chime. And then a voice. Distorted, yes, as if filtered through water or a great distance, but undeniably a voice. And it said my name. Michael Carter. Assistance required. Storage Bay B. My blood ran cold. Rule 4. Do not respond to any summons over the PA system after the final closing announcement, even if your name is used. And Rule 5. Storage Bay B, frozen goods sector, must remain locked and inaccessible between 3:33 a.m. and 4:04 a.m. Do not enter, do not look within. It wasn't 3:33 a.m. yet, not by a long shot, but the specific mention of Storage Bay B, coupled with my name, felt like a deliberate, targeted summons. The voice hadn't sounded like Miss Harper, or Frank, or any human I knew. It was older, calmer, infinitely patient, and utterly terrifying. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore it, to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard. But Jessica's pale face swam before my eyes, the fear for her overriding my own. What if this was a test? What if my compliance, or defiance, had some bearing on things? It was irrational, a desperate leap of logic born of fear and exhaustion. But the thought took root. Or perhaps it wasn't logic at all, but a compulsion, a subtle nudge from the store's omnipresent consciousness, guiding me towards a predetermined path. I found myself walking, my feet moving as if of their own accord, towards the frozen goods sector. The air grew noticeably colder with each step, the hum of the massive freezer units a low, menacing growl. Storage Bay B. Its heavy, insulated door was usually secured with a thick padlock. Tonight, the padlock was gone. The door itself... I remembered Frank's words. "Don't go looking for trouble where it sleeps soundest, son." But trouble, it seemed, had come looking for me. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the door. Just a peek, I told myself. Just a quick look to satisfy this gnawing, inexplicable urge. I pushed the door open a few more inches, my breath misting in the sudden blast of frigid air. The interior was darker than any freezer had a right to be, a profound, light-devouring blackness. And in that blackness, for a fraction of a second, I saw something. Not a shape, not a form, but a wrongness, a contortion of space, a flicker of impossible geometry that my mind recoiled from, unable to process. Then the door slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang that echoed through the silent store, trapping my gasp in my throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a pressure change. It was deliberate. The force of it vibrated through the floor, up my legs. For a long moment, I just stood there, paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The illusion of control, of any semblance of safety within these walls, shattered into a million icy fragments. I had looked. I had broken another rule, and the store had responded. A wave of intense cold washed over me, far colder than the ambient temperature of the freezer aisle. It was a psychic chill, a wave of pure, undiluted malevolence that seemed to emanate from Storage Bay B itself. I stumbled back, my legs weak, a strangled cry dying in my throat. The lights throughout the entire Omnimart flickered wildly, erratically, not just in my section, but everywhere, a chaotic, strobing Morse code of displeasure. And then, as suddenly as it began, the flickering stopped. The store returned to its usual humming, fluorescent stillness. But everything felt different, charged, hostile. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that I had crossed a significant threshold. I had not just broken a rule, I had trespassed. I had peered into a place I was not meant to see, acknowledged a summons I was meant to ignore. The store was no longer just observing me with a detached, curious intelligence. It was focused on me. I had its undivided and unwelcome attention. The game had changed, and I was no longer just a player. I was the target. The fragile illusion of my safety within the Omnimart had been utterly, irrevocably demolished. The aftermath of the Storage Bay B incident was a descent into a quiet, gnawing terror. The Omnimart no longer felt like a workplace, however strange. It felt like a cage, and I, the increasingly frantic occupant. The subtle oddities, the nudged cans and flickering lights, were replaced by a more overt, more personal campaign of psychological warfare. My reflection in the polished floor tiles would sometimes lag a fraction of a second behind my movements, or worse, wouldn't quite match my expression. A fleeting smirk or a widening of the eyes that wasn't my own. The security monitors, which I now avoided with a religious fervor, seemed to hum with a predatory energy whenever I passed, their dark screens like portals into an observant, malevolent void. Sleep offered no respite. The impossible geometry I'd glimpsed in Storage Bay B haunted my dreams, twisting familiar shapes into nightmarish configurations. I'd wake up shouting, the name Jessica a raw wound on my lips, the feeling of icy, unseen tendrils coiling around me. The store was invading my mind, its influence seeping into the very fabric of my consciousness. I tried to talk to Miss Harper, to feign concern about faulty wiring or a possible pest problem in Bay B, anything to gauge her reaction, to see if she knew. She listened with that same unnerving, polite smile, her eyes never leaving mine. "Everything is functioning optimally, Carter," she'd said. Her dismissal was a cold, hard slap. There would be no help from that quarter. She was either complicit, a willing servant of whatever dark intelligence ruled this place, or she was so deeply enmeshed in its system that she no longer recognized the abnormal. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair washing over me. I was alone in this, utterly alone. The mundane routines of stocking, facing, and rotating products became a Herculean effort, each action performed under a suffocating blanket of dread. The very air I breathed felt thick with unspoken threats, the silence pregnant with an imminent, terrifying revelation. It was Frank Dalton who finally threw me a lifeline, albeit a frayed and waterlogged one. He found me one morning, just before dawn, slumped on an overturned milk crate in the dairy aisle, staring blankly at a puddle of condensation that had formed on the floor, its shape disturbingly reminiscent of a grasping hand. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, his presence a familiar, if unsettling, fixture in my disintegrating world. Then he sighed, a sound like wind whistling through a broken window pane. "You looked in Bay B, didn't you, son?" he asked, his voice devoid of accusation, heavy with a weary resignation. I could only nod, the lump in my throat too large to speak. He clucked his tongue, a strangely paternal sound. "Some doors are best left unopened," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He then proceeded to tell me, in hushed, fragmented sentences, about the supervision. He didn't call it a ghost or a demon or anything so easily categorized. It was the store, or rather, the consciousness that had imprinted itself upon the land long before the Omnimart was built, an ancient territorial awareness that had merely incorporated the supermarket into its existing framework. It thrived on order, on routine, on the unquestioning obedience of those who moved within its domain. It watches, Frank explained, his gaze distant, and it learns. The rules, they're not for the store's benefit, they're for ours. Guardrails, ways to move through its patterns without disturbing them too much. He spoke of employees from years past, those who had ignored the warnings, who had delved too deep, who had listened too closely to the whispers in the ventilation. Some had quit, fleeing in terror. Others had simply become part of the inventory, as he put it, a chilling euphemism for a fate I didn't dare contemplate. Those who broke too many rules or the wrong rules became sintonizados, attuned, he explained. Their senses would twist. They'd start to perceive the store not as we did, but as it. The concept of sintonización, attunement, struck me with a visceral horror. Was that what was happening to me? The distorted reflections, the phantom sounds, the oppressive sense of being constantly monitored? Were these the first stages? Frank's words painted a grim picture, a slow erosion of self, a gradual merging with the store's alien consciousness until you were no longer an individual, but merely another sensor, another extension of the supervision's vast, unblinking awareness. The casual indifference of it was the most terrifying part. We were gnats, easily crushed, or, perhaps more disturbingly, assimilated. My world, the one I had desperately tried to keep separate from the Omnimart's encroaching darkness, had finally collapsed. The illusion of a normal job, of simply earning a paycheck to help Jessica, was gone. I was engaged in a silent, desperate struggle against an entity whose power and nature were beyond my comprehension. The established system of shift work, managerial oversight, and inventory control was nothing but a thin facade, a play staged for the benefit of an unseen ancient audience. And I, Michael Carter, was no longer just a stalker. I was a marked man, a discordant note in the supervision's carefully orchestrated symphony, and it was only a matter of time before it decided to silence me, or worse, to rewrite my part entirely. The reconfiguration was brutal. Hope, a fragile commodity I'd clung to, withered and died. My strategy, if it could even be called that, shifted from cautious avoidance to a desperate search for an escape, any escape, from this tightening net. But Frank's parting words that morning offered little solace. "There's no leaving, not really, once it has your scent," he'd said, his eyes like chips of ancient ice. "You can change jobs, change towns, but a part of it stays with you. You're on its ledger now, son, and the books always have to balance." The finality in his voice was a death knell to any lingering dreams of a simple exit. The days that followed Frank Dalton's unsettling revelations were steeped in a cloying, pervasive dread. Each shift at the Omnimart was a fresh torment, the mundane tasks of my job now overlaid with a terrifying new significance. Every flickering light, every misplaced item, every cold spot in an aisle felt like a deliberate communication from the supervision, a reminder of its constant, unwavering gaze. I moved through the store like a condemned man, acutely aware of my status as sintonizado, my senses already beginning to warp, to perceive the hidden currents beneath the surface of retail normalcy. The edges of my vision often shimmered, and faint, sibilant whispers seemed to ride on the edge of the ventilation system's hum, too indistinct to understand, but undeniably present. Frank, for all his grim pronouncements, became a reluctant, almost spectral ally. He wouldn't overtly help, wouldn't risk drawing further attention to himself. He was, I suspected, walking his own precarious tightrope with the supervision. But he would leave hints. A strategically placed old newspaper clipping in the break room detailing unexplained phenomena at the Omnimart's grand opening decades ago. A muttered comment about how some managers knew more than others about keeping the peace. It was through one of these oblique clues that I found the ledger. Rule 3. Expired items from the Fresh Delights deli counter must be logged only in the physical occurrence ledger, manager's office, never in the digital system. I'd always assumed it was just some outdated bureaucratic anomaly. Frank made me realize it was much more. He'd accidentally left Miss Harper's office door unlocked one night, a small, almost imperceptible lapse in his usual meticulous routine, just as she was called away to deal with a supposed coolant leak at the far end of the store, a leak I suspected Frank himself had subtly orchestrated. The physical occurrence ledger wasn't in plain sight. It was hidden, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard under her desk. A spot I only found because Frank had earlier complained about a squeaky board in that exact location, tapping it meaningfully with his foot. The ledger itself was ancient, its leather cover cracked and brittle, its pages filled with a multitude of spidery, faded scripts, a silent testament to generations of night shifters who had walked these cursed aisles before me. It wasn't just a log of spoiled pastrami and moldy cheese. Interspersed with the mundane entries were other notes, frantic scribbles, desperate pleas, chilling observations. Aisle 7 again, the cans, they watch. Heard my mother's voice from the PA, she's been dead 10 years. The mannequins, they moved, swear to God they moved. My own experiences, which I'd feared were unique signs of my unraveling sanity, were echoed in these faded, fearful confessions. I wasn't the first. I was merely the latest in a long, unfortunate line. The shared terror, strangely, brought a sliver of cold comfort. I wasn't mad, or at least not uniquely so. Buried deep within the ledger, amongst entries detailing flickering lights and disembodied whispers, I found what I was looking for, or perhaps what Frank had subtly guided me to find. An entry, dated nearly 30 years prior, written in a surprisingly steady academic hand, detailed a theory. The author, a former night manager named Alastair Finch, posited that the supervision, while powerful, was a creature of habit, of pattern. It drew its strength from the established routines of the store, from the predictable flow of energy and intention. Its rules were not just arbitrary, but were integral to maintaining these patterns. Finch believed that a significant, simultaneous disruption of all its established patterns, a cascade of broken rules, could potentially overload or reset its immediate focus, offering a brief window of something. He called it a pattern interrupt. Finch's notes also mentioned a ritual of apaziguamento, a term that sent a shiver down my spine, described in vague, almost fearful terms in older, nearly illegible entries. It seemed to involve offerings, specific placements of items, and a chant of names, but the details were lost to time or deliberate obfuscation. Finch dismissed it as superstition, but he did note that the ritual seemed designed to reinforce the supervision's patterns, not break them. His pattern interrupt theory was the opposite, a deliberate, chaotic shattering of the established order. It was incredibly risky. Finch himself had apparently attempted it. His entry stopped abruptly after that, the next page bearing only a single, ominous, blotchy red stain. Despite the chilling implication of Finch's fate, his theory ignited a desperate spark of hope within me. If the supervision was bound by patterns, then perhaps it had a weakness. Perhaps it could be confused, overwhelmed. It was a long shot, a suicidal gamble, but what other options did I have? Continue to slowly sintonizar, to lose myself piece by piece to the store's encroaching consciousness until I became another whisper in the vents, another shadow in the periphery? The thought was unbearable. Jessica needed me, not the hollow shell I was becoming, but me. The ledger also hinted at points of anchoring within the store, specific locations or even objects that seemed to hold a greater concentration of the supervision's influence. The apparel section mannequins, storage bay B, the deli counter, even the security office itself with its bank of monitors felt like a nerve center. Finch theorized that disrupting these anchors simultaneously with breaking the rules would amplify the pattern interrupt. It was a terrifying, complex undertaking, requiring a level of coordination and audacity that seemed almost impossible for one person, especially one as frayed and sleep-deprived as I was. But as I sat there in Miss Harper's silent, sterile office, the ancient ledger open on my lap, the hum of the Omnimart a menacing thrum in my ears, a new, cold resolve began to form. I had stumbled upon a hidden history, a secret war waged in the dead of night by forgotten souls. Alastair Finch had tried and, presumably, failed. But he had left a map, however dangerous, however incomplete. It was a desperate strategy, born of desperation, but it was a strategy. And in the suffocating darkness of the Omnimart, even the faintest glimmer of a plan felt like a beacon. The store wanted order. It wanted obedience. I would give it chaos. The decision, once made, settled in my gut like a stone, cold, heavy, and unyielding. There would be no more tiptoeing around the Omnimart's arbitrary edicts, no more cowering under the weight of its unseen gaze. If Alastair Finch's desperate theory held even a sliver of truth, then my only path lay through a deliberate, systematic desecration of every rule that had come to govern my nocturnal existence. The pattern interrupt. It sounded almost clinical, a far cry from the raw, primal terror the mere thought of it invoked. To knowingly invite the full, focused wrath of the supervision? The next few shifts were a blur of covert preparation and mounting dread. I studied the laminated list until its 7 commandments were burned into my memory, each one a note in the discordant symphony I planned to conduct. I mentally mapped out the store, pinpointing Finch's anchoring points, planning a route, a sequence of transgressions designed for maximum disruptive impact. The apparel section after 2 a.m., the self-returning product, the digital logging of deli spoilage, the PA system summons, storage bay B between its unholy hours, the red-inked shopping list, and finally, the security monitors. Each violation had to be timed, executed with a precision that belied the chaos I intended to unleash. Frank Dalton watched me with those ancient, knowing eyes. I didn't confide my plan to him directly. The risk was too great for both of us. But he saw the change in me, the grim resolve that had replaced the hunted fear. He saw me meticulously cleaning and oiling the wheels of a rarely used stocking cart, checking the batteries in an old, powerful flashlight I'd found. One morning, as I was about to clock out, he pressed a small, heavy-duty lighter into my hand. "Might need this," he'd rasped, his gaze unwavering. "Some things only fire can truly cleanse." It wasn't an endorsement, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the desperate path I was about to tread. The night I chose was a moonless Tuesday, the kind of deep, impenetrable darkness outside that made the Omnimart's fluorescent glare seem almost inviting, a deceptive haven. Before leaving for work, I called Jessica. My voice was carefully neutral, but the words felt heavy, freighted with unspoken goodbyes. I told her I loved her, lingered on the call a moment longer than usual, memorizing the sound of her sleepy, affectionate replies. The thought of her, of the life I was fighting to protect, of the normalcy I might never reclaim for myself, but could perhaps still secure for her, was the fuel for my terrifying resolve. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore, it was about drawing a line. As midnight struck and the last daytime employee shuffled out, leaving me, Frank, and Miss Harper to the store's nocturnal embrace, a strange calm descended. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overlaid with a kind of fatalistic clarity. I began my stocking routine, moving through the aisles with a deliberate slowness, every sense heightened. The hum of the freezers seemed louder, the shadows deeper, the air thick with an almost palpable anticipation. Or perhaps it was just my own overwrought nerves, projecting my internal state onto the indifferent architecture of the store. The first infraction was almost anticlimactic. A can of tomato soup, which I'd seen subtly roll from its shelf earlier, I picked up and deliberately, firmly placed back in its designated spot, violating the spirit of Rule 2. A faint tremor ran through the floor beneath my feet, a barely perceptible shudder. The game had begun. Next, the deli. I meticulously logged a tray of discolored turkey breast directly into the store's digital inventory system, bypassing the ancient leather-bound ledger entirely. The monitor of my handheld scanner flickered, displaying for a split second an image that looked disturbingly like a single unblinking eye, before returning to its normal interface. 2 a.m. arrived, and with it, aisle 12. The mannequins stood in their usual unsettling stillness. I walked straight up to the one in the garish sundress, the one that had reached for me weeks before. "Having a good night?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. The lights above didn't just flicker this time. They buzzed angrily, a sound like a trapped, furious insect, and one of the mannequin's plastic arms clattered loudly to the floor, shattering on the linoleum. The supervision was taking notice. Its displeasure was growing, and I was only just getting started. The symphony of chaos was building, and I, its unwilling conductor, braced myself for the crescendo. Frank, bless his weary soul, played his part. He discovered a major spill in the beverage aisle at the far end of the store, a sticky, spreading lake of orange soda that required Miss Harper's immediate and prolonged attention. It bought me precious time. Time to find a discarded shopping list, and this one, as if placed there by fate, was penned in the most lurid, blood-red ink I had ever seen. I didn't just ignore the shredder. I unfolded the list. Eggs, razor blades, silence, her name, and deliberately began to gather the items, placing them in my stocking cart, a perverse parody of a shopper. Each item I touched seemed to thrum with a cold, malevolent energy. The PA system remained stubbornly silent. The supervision, it seemed, wasn't going to make that part easy for me. But Rule 5, Storage Bay B, was approaching. 3:30 a.m., the heart of the store's unholiest hour. I pushed my cart, laden with its sinister cargo, towards the frozen goods sector. The lighter Frank had given me, a comforting weight in my pocket. The air grew frigid, the hum of the freezers a chorus of impending doom. This was it, the point of no return. I was about to knock on the door of something ancient and terrible, and I had no idea what would answer. But the thought of Jessica, her fragile hope, pushed me forward into the freezing, oppressive dark. The corridor leading to Storage Bay B was a tunnel of glacial air, each breath pluming before me like a ghostly accusation. The heavy insulated door, usually a symbol of mundane cold storage, now loomed like the entrance to a crypt. 3:32 a.m. The final minute before the prescribed time felt like an eternity, stretched taut with an unbearable tension. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the deep, resonant hum of the industrial freezers that seemed to be vibrating the very marrow in my bones. The items from the red ink list in my cart, a carton of eggs, a pack of gleaming razor blades, a silent, unopened dictionary for silence, I'd presumed, and a small, framed photograph of Jessica I always carried, her name, felt like unholy relics, offerings to an unseen, uncaring deity. As the clock on my battered watch ticked over to 3:33 a.m., I didn't hesitate. There was no room left for hesitation, only a cold, surgical resolve. I wrenched open the door to Storage Bay B. The darkness within was absolute, a devouring void that seemed to swallow the feeble beam of my flashlight whole. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, a palpable entity of shadow. And the cold? It was a living thing, a biting, invasive force that clawed at my exposed skin and sought to freeze the air in my lungs. I stepped inside, pushing the cart before me, the metallic screech of its wheels on the frozen floor an obscene violation of the tomb-like silence. The impossible geometry I had glimpsed before was now clearer, not in a visual sense, for there was nothing to see but that oppressive, light-eating blackness. But I could feel it, the warping of space, the subtle, nauseating twist of dimensions that defied Euclidean logic. It was like standing on the threshold of another reality, a place where the laws of physics were merely suggestions, easily discarded. And at the center of that spatial distortion, I sensed it, the supervision, not as a monster, not as a defined shape, but as a vast, cool, and utterly alien intelligence. It was ancient, patient, and now deeply, profoundly annoyed. I began the ritual, my own desperate, improvised version. I took the eggs from the cart and, one by one, smashed them against the frozen, unseen walls, the splattering sound obscenely loud in the crushing silence. The razor blades I scattered across the floor, their metallic glint swallowed by the darkness. The dictionary I opened to a random page and left splayed open, a futile offering of human language to something that communicated in shifts of temperature and pressure. And then the photograph of Jessica. My hand trembled as I propped it against an invisible shelf. Her smiling face. The reaction was not immediate, but when it came, it was overwhelming. The temperature plummeted further, a killing frost that bit through my layers of clothing. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the faint, sibilant whispers I'd grown accustomed to swelled into a cacophony, a chorus of disembodied voices murmuring in 1,000 forgotten tongues, their words just beyond the threshold of comprehension, but their intent unmistakably malevolent. And then, the PA system, throughout the entire store, not just in Bay B, shrieked to life. Not with a voice, but with a sound. A sound of pure, unadulterated rage, a keening, multi-dimensional shriek that bypassed my ears and slammed directly into my skull, threatening to shatter my sanity. Rule 4, broken with a vengeance. The final act. The security monitors. I stumbled out of Storage Bay B, the shrieking of the PA system chasing me, the oppressive presence of the supervision clinging to me like grave mold. The main security office, usually Ms. Harper's sterile sanctuary, was a maelstrom of flickering screens. I stood before the central console, the array of monitors displaying 100 distorted fisheye views of the chaotic store. And I stared. I stared directly into the largest monitor, the one that usually showed the main entrance, but now reflected only my own pale, terrified face, my eyes wide and haunted. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Rule 7 shattered. My reflection began to change. It wasn't a settled distortion this time. My eyes in the monitor bled to black, inky pools of utter emptiness. My mouth stretched into a silent, impossibly wide rictus grin. And then my reflection moved independently of me, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, its blackened eyes fixing me with an expression of cold, predatory amusement. It raised a hand, its hand, and pressed it against the screen from the inside, the glass seeming to ripple like water. And from that rippling surface, a shadowy, multi-jointed tendril, blacker than the deepest night, began to emerge, reaching for me. Suddenly, Ms. Harper was there, no longer the prim manager, but a vessel. Her eyes were the same inky black as my reflections, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You have disrupted the pattern," she hissed, her voice a discordant chorus of the whispers I'd been hearing for weeks. "You have broken the flow. Now you will become integrated." Shadowy forms began to coalesce in the corners of the office, indistinct figures with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with a faint internal luminescence. The sintonizados, perhaps, or direct manifestations of the supervision's fractured attention. They advanced, silent and inexorable. This was it. The absolute, the confrontation with the core of the Omnimart's madness. There was no logic here, no reason, only an ancient alien order that I had irrevocably shattered. The tendril from the monitor was almost upon me, its touch promising a cold, sanity-devouring oblivion. And in that moment of ultimate despair, as the shadows closed in, I remembered Frank's lighter and Alastair Finch's final desperate act. The ledger. The heart. With the last dregs of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I lunged for Ms. Harper's desk, a wild, desperate gamble. The shadowy tendril from the monitor brushed my cheek, a touch like frozen needles, and a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror shot through me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. The sintonizados, or whatever they were closing in, their silent, multi-limbed forms a nightmarish tableau in the flickering emergency strobe lighting that had now kicked in throughout the store. Ms. Harper, her face a mask of serene, black-eyed malevolence, reached for me with hands that seemed to elongate, her fingers tipped with razor-sharp nails. It was a scene ripped from the deepest, darkest recesses of a fever dream. My fumbling hand found the loose floorboard, wrenched it up. The ancient leather-bound ledger lay there, almost pulsing with a faint, sickly luminescence in the chaotic light. It felt francs lighter. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled in my pocket, found its cool, metallic certainty. With a flick of my thumb, a tiny, defiant flame sprang to life, a beacon of orange in the encroaching, Stygian gloom. I held the flame to the corner of the ancient ledger. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The old leather seemed to resist, to repel the heat. Then, with a reluctant, almost mournful sigh, it caught. A small, hungry flame licked at the brittle pages, then another and another, spreading with an unnatural speed. The ink on the pages seemed to writhe and bleed as the fire consumed them, releasing a thin, acrid smoke that smelled of burnt dust and forgotten sorrows. The reaction from the supervision was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The multi-dimensional shriek that had been tearing through my skull intensified to an unbearable, sanity-shredding crescendo, then, abruptly, cut off, replaced by a sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering in slow motion. The shadowy tendril recoiled from the monitor as if struck, dissolving into a puff of oily smoke. The advancing sintonizados froze mid-stride, their forms flickering and distorting like faulty holograms. Miss Harper let out a choked, gasping cry, her black eyes flickering rapidly between emptiness and a dawning, horrified confusion, before she collapsed to the floor in a heap, her features slowly returning to their normal human state. The entire Omnimart seemed to convulse. Lights exploded in showers of sparks, shelves toppled with deafening crashes. The very floor beneath my feet bucked and groaned, as if the building were caught in an earthquake. The oppressive, intelligent cold that had permeated the store vanished, replaced by the mundane chill of the air conditioning. The sense of being watched, of being constantly assessed and judged by an alien consciousness, lifted, like a physical weight being removed from my soul. It was over, or at least this particular battle was. The pattern interrupt, amplified by the destruction of the ledger, had worked. The store was silent, truly silent, for the first time since I'd started working there. As the last page of the ledger crumbled into glowing embers in my hand, the laminated list of essential nightly directives in my back pocket suddenly grew intensely hot, searing through the fabric of my jeans. I yelped, pulling it out. The 7 rules were still there, but beneath them, glowing with a faint crimson light, a new line of text was appearing, as if being written by an invisible, fiery pen. 8. He who burns the ledger becomes the new scribe. The patterns must be maintained. The heat subsided, but the words remained, stark and undeniable. A cold dread, entirely different from the terror I'd just experienced, began to seep into me. I hadn't escaped. I had merely changed roles. The transformation, if that's what it was subtle, internal. The shimmering at the edge of my vision didn't disappear, but it clarified. The faint whispers didn't cease, but they became understandable, not as words, but as impulses, as a raw data stream of the store state. I could feel the Omnimart around me, not as an oppressive enemy, but as a vast, complex system, temporarily disrupted, yes, but already beginning to reassert its ancient underlying order. And I felt, with a chilling certainty, A new, unwelcome responsibility settling upon me. The scribe. The one who now understood, and perhaps was meant to enforce, the patterns. The sirens in the distance were the first intrusion of the outside world, a shrill, unwelcome reminder that a reality existed beyond the shattered, groaning confines of the Omnimart. Frank Dalton found me amidst the debris of the security office, dazed and covered in soot, the acrid smell of burnt leather and ozone clinging to me like a second skin. He helped me up, his old eyes surprisingly clear, a strange mixture of pity and something like respect in their depths. I quit the Omnimart the next day, or rather, I simply didn't go back. They didn't call. Perhaps my records, along with the ledger, had been cleansed by the fire. I found a new job, a mind-numbingly dull daytime position sorting packages at a cavernous distribution warehouse on the other side of the county. The pay was less, the hours were grueling in their own mundane way, but it was blessedly, gloriously normal. Jessica's medical bills remained a mountain, but I scraped by, driven by a desperate need to put as much distance, both physical and psychological, between myself and Crestwood Hills. I told myself I was free. But the Omnimart, or the supervision, or whatever ancient patient intelligence resided there, had left its indelible mark. The syntonization, the attunement, hadn't fully receded. Sometimes, in the quiet hum of the warehouse, I'd feel it, a faint echo of that cold, observant presence. My vision would shimmer at the periphery. I'd catch myself noticing patterns in the stacking of boxes, in the flow of conveyor belts, patterns that felt significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate. And the whispers? They were still there, fainter now, but present, like the lingering tinnitus after a loud explosion. They spoke of order, of routine, of the delicate balance of unseen energies. The laminated list, with its newly inscribed 8th rule, I kept hidden away, a cursed relic I couldn't bring myself to destroy. He who burns the ledger becomes the new scribe. The patterns must be maintained. What patterns? Whose patterns? The responsibility it implied was a cold, heavy weight in my soul. Was I now an unwilling agent of the supervision, a sleeper cell waiting for some unknown activation? The thought was a constant, low-grade torment. I tried to ignore it, to immerse myself in the mindless repetition of my new job, to focus on Jessica's slow, fragile recovery. Then, about 6 months after I'd fled Crestwood Hills, an envelope arrived at my small, anonymous apartment. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, not laminated this time, but printed on cheap, flimsy stock. The heading, Warehouse Operational Protocols, Sector Gamma. My sector. Below it, a list of 7 new rules, each one as bizarre and unsettlingly specific as those from the Omnimart. 1. Cartons marked with a blue spiral must never be stacked higher than 3 units. 2. If a package is found to be emitting a low hum, report it to Shift Supervisor Thorne, no relation, I prayed, but do not open it under any circumstances. And so on. My blood turned to ice. My hands trembled as I flipped the sheet over. There, on the back, in a faint, almost invisible script that seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, was the 8th rule, the one I now carried seared into my memory. The patterns must be maintained. It wasn't just the Omnimart, it was everywhere. These points of confluence, these thin places where the mundane rubbed up against something ancient and strange, they existed all over, and I, the unwilling scribe, was somehow attuned to them, drawn to them, or perhaps they were drawn to me. I haven't burned this new list. Not yet. What would be the point? Another would simply appear. The cycle, I now understood, was not broken, merely transferred. I still work at the warehouse. I follow the new rules, meticulously. Not out of fear, not anymore, but out of a grim, weary understanding. The patterns must be maintained. And I am their keeper, their reluctant guardian, walking a tightrope between the world I know and the vast, indifferent, and utterly alien intelligence that hums just beneath its surface, waiting, always waiting. Jessica is doing better. Her laughter is a little stronger, her color a little brighter. For her, I maintain the facade of normalcy. For her, I trudge through my days, sorting packages, adhering to protocols both written and unwritten. But at night, in the quiet of my small room, I feel the whispers. I see the patterns in the static of the television screen, in the way the moonlight falls across the floor. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror,